They tell you the story of the 300. But almost no one tells you the real reason they died in that mountain pass, and it wasn't the Persian army. It was one man walking quietly into an enemy camp, offering to sell a secret for a price. In the summer of 480 BC, a Spartan king stood at the edge of a narrow strip of rock and sea, knowing, truly knowing, that he would not walk away from it alive. And he did it anyway, without complaint, without hesitation, as though the ending had already been written, and he was simply the one chosen to read the final line out loud. To understand why, we have to go back a few years earlier, to a defeat the Persian Empire never forgave. The Persian Empire had grown faster than almost any power the ancient world had ever seen, stretching from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the edges of India, swallowing kingdoms in Anatolia, crossing into Egypt, reaching as far as North Africa. But an empire that grows that fast makes enemies just as quickly, and the lands it swallowed had a habit of trying to break free. When the Greek cities of Athens and Eretria backed a rebellion against Persian rule, the Persian king Darius saw two things at once: an insult that demanded punishment, and an opening, a doorway into Europe itself. He sent his armies west. Thrace fell. Macedonia bent the knee. Eretria was taken. And then Persian forces marched straight for Athens, expecting an easy victory. They didn't get one. On the plain of Marathon, a smaller Athenian force broke the Persian advance and sent the survivors back to their ships. It was humiliating. It was public. And it was the kind of defeat that doesn't end with a treaty. It ends with a promise of return. Darius never got the chance to keep that promise. He died before he could march again. But the desire for revenge didn't die with him. It passed like an inheritance to his son, Xerxes. Where his father had seen an opportunity, Xerxes saw an obligation. He spent years preparing what would become one of the largest military forces the ancient world had ever assembled, and in 481 BC he sent messengers across Greece with a simple demand: submit or be destroyed. Most of the smaller Greek states quietly agreed. Fear is a very persuasive diplomat. But two cities refused outright: Athens and Sparta, and the way they refused tells you everything about who they were. In Athens, the Persian envoys were thrown into a deep pit. In Sparta, into a well. The message was unmistakable: find what you're looking for down there yourselves. There was no walking that back. War was coming, and for the first time in generations, the fractured, endlessly feuding city-states of Greece did something almost unheard of. They set aside their rivalries and formed an alliance. Athens brought its growing navy. Sparta brought the most feared land army in the ancient world. Together, they had a chance. Alone, they had none. The Athenian strategist Themistocles proposed a plan built around a single piece of geography, a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, where the mountains pressed almost to the sea, so tight that a massive army would be forced to funnel through in a line barely wide enough for a handful of men to fight side by side. Numbers wouldn't matter there, only formation would. At the same time, the Allied fleet would hold the strait beside it, so the Persian navy couldn't simply sail around and land troops behind the defenders. It was a good plan, but it arrived at the worst possible moment. The Persian army was spotted approaching just as Sparta entered a sacred religious festival, during which Spartan law forbade any military campaign. To break that law was considered an offense against the gods themselves. So instead of sending the full Spartan army, the city's leadership made a smaller, almost symbolic gesture. They sent King Leonidas, along with his personal guard of 300 men, to hold the pass until the festival ended and reinforcements could follow. According to the historian Herodotus, before Leonidas ever left Sparta, the city had consulted the oracle at Delphi and received a warning. Either Sparta itself would fall, or Sparta would lose a king. Leonidas seems to have understood exactly what that meant. He didn't go to Thermopylae expecting to win. He went expecting to buy time with the only currency he had left. Joined by volunteers from other Greek cities, his force grew to roughly 7,000 men. Against them came an army historians of the time inflated to almost unbelievable numbers, millions according to some ancient accounts. Modern historians place the real figure much lower, somewhere between 70,000 and 300,000. Still, by any honest count, the defenders were outnumbered at least 10 to 1, and for 2 full days it didn't matter. The pass was so narrow that the size of the Persian army became a disadvantage instead of a strength. Their arrows fell harmlessly against Greek shields. Their shorter spears couldn't reach past the long Greek spears bristling from the front line like the teeth of some enormous animal. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers pressed forward and were pressed right back, unable to bring their numbers to bear in a space built for a fight of a completely different scale. Even Xerxes' most elite unit, the Immortals, his personal palace guard, trained from childhood for nothing but war, could not break the line. By the end of the second day, the Persian forces had suffered devastating losses, and Xerxes had no clear way forward. It said he rose from his throne 3 times in fury, watching his empire's finest soldiers fail against a few thousand Greeks in a gap barely wide enough to march through. And this is where the story stops being about strength and starts being about betrayal. There was a path, a narrow mountain track that curled around behind Thermopylae entirely, avoiding the pass altogether. Leonidas knew about it. He'd stationed a unit there specifically to guard it. But a local man named Ephialtes, motivated by the promise of a reward, went to the Persian camp and offered to show them the way around. His name would go on to mean something very specific in the Greek language for centuries afterward. It became the word for betrayal itself. That night, a detachment of immortals moved along the ridge under cover of darkness. The defenders guarding the path spotted them too late, and Leonidas received the news at dawn. The Greeks were no longer facing an army in front of them. They were surrounded. Most of the Allied forces withdrew, a reasonable, even necessary decision, since holding the pass no longer served any purpose. But Leonidas and his 300 stayed. So did a small number of others, roughly 1,400 men in total, who chose to remain rather than retreat. What happened next wasn't a battle in the traditional sense anymore. It was closer to a final statement. Leonidas pushed his remaining force into the wider part of the pass and met the Persian advance from both directions at once, fighting first with spears until they broke, and then with whatever remained in their hands. Leonidas himself fell in the fighting, and a fierce struggle broke out over his body, each side refusing to let the other claim it. By the end, every one of the defenders who stayed was gone, but they didn't go alone. Ancient sources claim they brought down more than 20,000 Persian soldiers with them in those final hours, a staggering toll for a force that size. When Xerxes finally found Leonidas among the dead, his fury hadn't cooled. He ordered a final, symbolic act of disrespect against the king's remains, a punishment meant to erase Leonidas' honor. It didn't work. If anything, it did the opposite. The pass fell. The road to Athens was open, and the Persian army marched on. In purely military terms, Thermopylae was a defeat. But defeats don't usually get remembered for 25 centuries. This one did, because somewhere between the betrayal, the impossible odds, and a king who walked toward a prophecy instead of away from it, 300 men turned a lost battle into something the rest of history couldn't stop retelling. So here's the question worth sitting with. If Leonidas had known about the path from the very beginning, if he'd understood that no matter what he did, the ending was already fixed, would you have stayed anyway? If stories like this pull you in, subscribe. There's a lot more history waiting to be uncovered.